Okay, let's be real. Is Yoko Taro a complete genius or an insatiable troll? Welcome back to OtakuDaiKun. Dai here. Today's video is brought to you by $50 Subscribe Star member Distant Persona, who requested I cover the unconventional storytelling of Yoko Taro, the madman behind the Drakengard and Nier titles. Now, while Taro's games are no doubt infamous, I've only personally played two of them, Drakengard 3 and Nier Automata, quite obviously because of their bomb-in waifu playable protagonists. Seriously, nothing gets me more excited for a game than an attractive woman kicking ass. That said, even just between these two games, I feel I have plenty of material to formulate not only an understanding, but a progression over time of Taro's bizarre yet intriguing approach to creating games. The one aspect I want to focus on is the concept of aesthetic distance. For most fictional stories, either told through films, plays, books, or games, the author's goal is to completely immerse you in the world they've created. They want audiences to feel like, say, Middle-earth is a comprehensive world you could actually visit and inhabit. In this regard, the various physical aspects of production, such as cameras, code, pages, and microphones, are hidden or otherwise obscured so that viewers don't pay attention to them. For video games, it's a huge reason playtesting exists. Nothing breaks your immersion quite like a glitched out or buggy enemy. Creators typically want to avoid unplanned errors, like NPCs butting in or interrupting cutscenes. While it's obvious we understand we're playing a video game when we do, developers often want us to blissfully ignore that fact in favor of soaking up the fictional world they've created. However, in both artistic and academic circles, creators sometimes challenge this idea. When we're fully immersed in a work of fiction, when there is a close aesthetic distance, we tend to think less critically of it, going along with the flow subconsciously. To some, that's a huge missed opportunity, especially when a creator has a profound message to convey. Every creative medium has conventions and techniques that can further immerse audiences, but they also have aspects that can immediately break that immersion, and some creators actually want to do this to their viewers, so that they can remain active participants in the thought process of their work, rather than having them just passively go along for the ride. In other words, they want to broaden the aesthetic distance between audiences and the fictional world presented. And as it turns out, Yoko Taro is very much one of these creators. Aesthetic distance can be broadened in a number of ways, and for varying reasons. The most common and straightforward method is breaking the fourth wall. Simply have the characters in a story acknowledge they're not real, or that this is all an act. Imagine going to see a play, and while two actors are engaged in a dramatic sword fight, one of them leaps off the stage, grabs a purse from the audience, and uses it to clobber the other. The audience can no longer treat what's on stage as a separate world. Another method is to be metafictional, to incorporate aspects of a work's creation into its story. Monty Python is great at this. In The Holy Grail, Arthur and his knights escape from the monstrous Black Beast, not through any heroics of their own, but because the film's animator suddenly dies. The ending of the film follows the same logic. Just as Arthur is about to storm a French castle, the police arrive and arrest the actors and film crew. The game Conker's Bad Fur Day is notorious for this, as the final boss, a literal xenomorph from the Aliens franchise, is killed because Conker works out a deal with the game's programmers, keeping secret about a rather glaring glitch in order to procure a katana. Sure, these examples are played for laughs, but that's because introducing aesthetic distance can be surprising, and therefore funny. A masterclass in broadening the aesthetic distance between an audience and the fictional world happens to be the quirky presentational style of Studio Shaft. Shows like Monogatari will frequently cut to unfinished assets, chapter cards, and other production elements that obviously don't exist in the world Araragi inhabits. This distances or alienates us from Araragi's world, reminding us that we are indeed watching an anime. Thus, when the characters muse philosophy as they often do through extensive dialogue scenes, we viewers are in a mental state to analyze these profound ideas, not just as they exist in Monogatari's world, but also in how they pertain to our own daily lives. Establishing a broad aesthetic distance needn't be so literal either. The director Satoshi Kon alienates audiences through violating narrative cohesion and continuity. In watching films like Perfect Blue, or series like Paranoia Agent, viewers are forced to question whether what they're seeing is actually happening as part of the story. Is Shonen Bad a real person? Is Mima psychotic? We wonder this because the editing and exaggeration have broken our foundation of how a film is typically told to us. Arguably, this helps audiences better analyze his works, thinking less about what's happening to the characters, and more about what the film as a whole is trying to tell us. For Paranoia Agent, it can be as profound as making a statement of how Japan used the World War II nuclear strikes as an excuse to turn a blind eye to their own war crimes and hide behind a culture of adorable mascots. There's no denying that certain creators experiment with aesthetic distance. The real question, however, is whether or not these experiments are successful. Do they help audiences grasp a deeper understanding of the work, or do they just ruin all the fun? In our case, is Yoko Taro a creative genius, or just a charismatic troll? I'd like to give the guy some credit for actually sticking to his guns, responding of complaints of 2B's sex appeal by requesting an archive of lewd fan art. The guy really likes attractive women, but can he tell a decent story with them? First, let's look at Drakengard 3. When playing, it helps to have an understanding of the first Drakengard, but for our purposes it's good the game's technically a prequel. The game is an action RPG in which you control Zero, an intoner hell-bent on slaughtering her own sisters. Most of the game is spent using various weapons and combos to defeat enemies, including a handful of bullet hell sections where Zero rides upon her dragon Mikhail. While a tad clunky, I found this gameplay satisfying and engaging. I was able to proceed through the story while invested in Zero, specifically the source of her desire to murder the other intoners. But then, Yoko Taro introduces a concept that challenges this immersion: multiple endings. Normally, a game with different endings serves to provide more immersion by giving players the choice to follow different paths. In Drakengard 3, however, the game follows a mostly linear structure. You have to reach each of the endings and watch the credits a handful of times before truly beating the game. This makes us question what an ending actually is. Is it when we see the credits roll, or is it when you've seen everything the game has to offer? Either way, players will have to get used to following a certain timeline, only for it to be subverted by another. To me, this makes huge strides in the narrative lose their value, as the people you've killed or the friends you've made may no longer be there from one ending to another. That said, nothing tops the absurdity of the game's final boss. After an entire journey full of leveling up and strengthening Zero, the ultimate test doesn't rely on any of those things. Instead, players are thrust into a sadistic rhythm game without warning. Seriously, it looks like a cutscene preceding another bullet hell stage, but before any crosshairs appear on screen, Mikhail just suddenly dies. It took me a few attempts to realize what Yoko Taro had pulled. The statues of the other intoners start releasing these rings, which will kill Mikhail unless you press the X button precisely when they reach him. This in itself is completely alienating, but the experience gets worse, in that the intoners, Mikhail, and the camera all change positions throughout the minigame, going so far as to completely obscure Mikhail from view, leaving players to guess when to press X. The nightmarish cherry on top, however, is that the music slows, the screen fades to black, but the game keeps going, requiring you to press X with no clear audio-visual cues to go from. Thankfully, truly virtuous people on the internet created a video showing an actual UI for players to sync up to their gameplay. This was one of the most frustrating things I've ever done. Not just in a game, but in my entire life, as even one mistake forces you to start from the beginning. The game's final boss is the ultimate example of imposing aesthetic distance. No matter how strong or skilled players become, they will all have to pass this section to complete the game. Changing the entire genre so suddenly forces players to realize they're not just killing the intoners. They're playing a game that can change the rules at any time. Given that this is the greatest gaming whiplash I've ever experienced, I'd expect it to have been done for good reason. Was there a grand purpose for Taro to yank us right out of his own narrative creation? As far as I can tell, no. Not that I was able to comprehend anyway. Was he trying to make us feel powerless? Defeated? Is this final boss supposed to challenge us, in the same way that an eldritch horror terrifies people beyond their ability to comprehend? Perhaps, but for me, the game lacks the necessary context to make me feel like there was any point to it. If anything, it actually made me forget about the story entirely, only beating the game for the sake of beating it. Feel free to enlighten me if you found this final boss meaningful, but I'm gonna have to call it a troll. Whatever significance Taro wanted to communicate failed spectacularly. Nier Automata, on the other hand, I feel achieves what Drakengard could not, at times anyway. The concept of multiple linear endings persists, but is now contextualized by the fact that events are actually repeating throughout the story. The game's sudden jump from combos to bullet hell is contextualized by in-person combat and hacking, respectively. It actually manages to make the player feel powerless when their UI glitches out and your characters start to limp and struggle. This is all due to the context. The fact that our heroes are machines means that them breaking down and malfunctioning actually resonates with the idea that our gaming hardware might be doing the same thing. It's far less frustrating about it too, introducing these mechanics early and frequently enough that it's not too jarring. These techniques indeed instill aesthetic distance. We're keenly aware we're playing a video game, and yet somehow that fact actually makes it easier to understand what the androids are going through. Machines are, by design, tools. If they break, they can be replaced, but Nier Automata challenges that notion by weaving an emotional narrative around such fragile machines. This goes for the love and tragedy of 2B and 9S, who are often forced to die to complete their mission. While their bodies are destroyed, they're usually able to retrieve what's important: their mind, their memories. This is why it's relatively profound when the game asks you at the end to delete your save file for the sake of someone else. In truth, even the first ever player of the game is going to get help from what appears to be other players. The actual sacrifice itself is cosmetic, but just the thought of having to lose a save file makes players question its value. There are a lot of ways to interpret the loss. If we think of the save file as the consciousness of the characters, then it's as though the characters have now truly died. After all, when we die, our memories aren't worth much anymore. Not to us, anyway. This is why many people try to leave behind proof that they lived. Monuments, records, achievements, legends. We try to leave these behind knowing our consciousness is temporal. In many ways, this is what the save file often means to the player. It stands to document all the hard effort we put into our games, possibly long after we ourselves forget about it. So long as it's still around, we can rekindle those moments. And yet, the game giving us a chance to throw that away reminds us that even these records are fragile. Even if you back your file up to the cloud, eventually the machine storing that data, be it the server or your PlayStation, will break down. Statues erode, books rot, machines break, and testimony warps when told from person to person. Thus, a save file is no more important than our memory of having played the game, the emotions we felt along the way. To that end, there are actually benefits of deleting your data. Even if cosmetic, your username will become part of another player's experience during the credits. You will have impacted their memories. Plus, it gives you an excuse to start the game over, just like how 2B and 9S appear to be rebuilt post-credits. Obviously, there are just as many benefits to keeping your save data. Items, money, weapons, levels, all that stuff remains and helps when trying to fight secret bosses and the like. But I think forcing players to stop and think, that in itself is a worthwhile endeavor. I'm not about to say this is how players should interpret the game, but it's clear that Yoko Taro wants us to think actively while playing. I mentioned before in my video about whether JRPG heroes were actually poachers or not, but Taro adds more distance by essentially making players feel bad about defeating enemies. Normally, a game would reward you with glorious fanfare for killing, and yet the machines in Automata beg for their lives. You're less motivated to grind, instead fighting only when provoked by the enemy, and the game is actually balanced around that. The main story isn't so difficult that you can't win while sparing the innocent, and this ties back to the game's end, making it even easier for players to discard their saves. Perhaps this is the very same message Yoko Taro was trying to convey in Drakengard 3. After all, both pressure the player's desire to conventionally master the game exclusively through combat. Regardless, I can't exactly say I enjoy it. Like I said at the start, I began playing both games because I wanted to kick ass as a hot chick, not to question the moral implications of my fictional rampage. Both games gave me very unique experiences that no other games have, but they're not necessarily the experiences I wanted. I think Nier Automata works better, because even the jarring bits are still totally possible and fun for players. Plus, there's an ironic twist to this whole aesthetic distance angle. Sometimes, by forcing players not to get too immersed in a fictional world, they actually feel more connected to it. Sure, you'll be forced to step back from the existential drama of the story, but in return you'll be confronted with equally difficult choices that mimic the importance and severity of the characters' decisions. After all, a video game can't mechanically rob you of a loved one, but it sure does feel like a profound sacrifice to lose hard-earned save data. So there you have it. Aesthetic distance keeps an audience from their immersion into a work of fiction by calling attention to the physical medium used to create it. Most creators want you to be immersed, but others insist that a more meaningful experience can be had if audiences are kept on their toes. I think the answer to that is subjective. Generally, I'm not a huge fan, because as much as I like to go into games to experience something new, I prefer it to be done within a set of mechanics I recognize and understand. What about you, however? Do you like it when games call attention to the fact that they're games? Let's take this discussion to the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, help me beat the algorithm by liking, commenting, and sharing the video, subscribing to OtakuDaiKun, and, most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of my anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content. If you want to support me directly, there are now 3 ways that all provide the same benefits. You can click join here on YouTube, or join Patreon or Subscribestar for access to exclusive vids and early access. As always, celebrate your fandom.